Somewhere deep in the quiet darkness of a cave, a hand pressed against cold stone. That hand belonged to someone who lived 50,000 years ago, someone who had never seen a city, someone who had never held a book, someone who had never heard the word civilization. And yet, that hand moved with purpose. It carved something into the rock, not randomly, not carelessly, but with intention, with meaning. With a kind of knowing that we, even today, with all our technology and all our science, have not fully understood. That carving is still there, waiting. And the question that whispers through the ages is simple and yet impossible to answer fully. What were they trying to tell us? Take a slow breath. Let your body settle, because what we are about to explore together is not just history. It is not just archaeology. It is something much quieter, much deeper, and much more personal than that. It is the story of human thought itself. It is the story of the first time a mind looked at the world and said, I need to remember this. I need to leave this behind. I need someone somewhere someday to understand what I understood. Welcome, gentle listener. Tonight we are going on a very slow journey, a journey that will take us back 50,000 years, into caves lit only by small fires, into landscapes of ice and silence, into the minds of people who were in almost every way exactly like us. They felt wonder, they felt fear, they felt love and loss and curiosity, and they left us messages, messages carved into stone, messages painted onto cave walls, messages that have survived ice ages, floods, earthquakes, and the slow grinding passage of 50 millennia, and we are still trying to read them. So tonight, let us try, together, slowly, with patience and with wonder. Let us sit beside that ancient fire and listen to what the stone is trying to say. Let us begin with a single object. It was found in a place called Blombo's Cave, a small cave on the southern coast of South Africa, a place where the cold ocean wind still blows in from the sea, just as it did thousands of years ago. Inside this cave, buried under layers of sand and ash and time, archaeologists found something extraordinary. A small piece of ochre. Ochre is a kind of reddish-brown stone. Ancient people used it for many things. They used it to color their skin. They used it in burial rituals. They mixed it with fat to make a kind of paint. But this piece of ochre was different, because carved into its surface with careful and deliberate marks was a pattern, a crosshatch pattern, a series of lines crossing each other at angles, repeated again and again with remarkable consistency. Now, to modern eyes, this might seem simple, almost like something a child might scratch into a rock while bored. But here is what makes it extraordinary. This piece of ochre is approximately 73,000 years old. 73,000 years. To understand how long ago that is, consider this. The pyramids of Egypt were built roughly 4,500 years ago. The ancient city of Rome was founded about 2,800 years ago. Even the oldest known writing system, the Sumerian script, is only about 5,000 years old. 73,000 years is 15 times older than the pyramids. It is a number so large that the human mind struggles to hold it. And yet, on this small piece of stone, someone made marks. Deliberate, repeated, meaningful marks. The question is not just when they made them. The question is why. Now, let us sit with this for a moment. Because the easy answer is to say, well, perhaps it was just decoration. Perhaps someone was simply playing with a stone, passing time, making patterns for the pleasure of making patterns. And that is possible. But here is what the researchers noticed when they studied this piece of ochre very carefully. The lines were not random. They were made with consistent pressure, with a consistent angle. The spacing between the lines was remarkably even. This was not the casual scratching of someone who was bored. This was someone who knew what they were doing, someone who had a plan, someone who was, in the truest sense of the word, creating something. And this raises a question that archaeologists and anthropologists have been quietly wrestling with for decades. At what point did the human mind become capable of creating symbols? At what point did a mark on a stone stop being just a mark and start being a message? To understand this, we need to travel a little further back in time. Not 73,000 years. Further, much further. About 300,000 years ago, our species, Homo sapiens, first appeared on this earth. We emerged in Africa, most likely in the region that is now Morocco or Ethiopia. We were physically very similar to how we are today. Same basic body, same size brain. But the evidence suggests that something important was still developing inside that brain. Something that scientists call symbolic thought. Symbolic thought is the ability to let one thing represent another. The ability to look at a curved line and say, that represents the moon. The ability to look at a red mark on a stone and say, that represents blood or life or danger or the sacred. Without symbolic thought, you can communicate, but only directly. You can point at a fruit and say, eat this. You can make a sound that means danger and everyone runs. But with symbolic thought, something opens up. Suddenly you can talk about things that are not present. You can describe something that happened yesterday or something that might happen tomorrow. You can create a story. You can pass knowledge from one person to another, not just by showing them, but by telling them. And most importantly, for our story tonight, you can leave a message for someone you will never meet. Someone 50,000 years in your future. The Blombos cave ochre is one of the earliest examples we have found of this kind of thinking. But it is not the only one. Around the same time, in the same region of southern Africa, archaeologists have found other signs of symbolic behavior. Shell beads that were carefully perforated, as if to be strung together and worn. Collections of unusual stones that seem to have been kept not for any practical purpose, but simply because they were beautiful or interesting. These are small things, easy to overlook, but they tell a profound story. They tell us that long before the famous cave paintings of Europe, long before the sculptures and the carvings that we usually think of when we think of prehistoric art, human beings were already thinking symbolically, already making meaning, already reaching out across time. Now, let us move forward. Let us travel from Africa to Europe. Because it is in Europe, in the caves of France and Spain and Germany, that we find the most spectacular and the most mysterious expressions of this ancient symbolic mind. And it is here that the real mystery deepens. Imagine you are standing at the entrance of a cave in southern France. The year, in our modern calendar, is somewhere around 36,000 years ago. The world outside is cold. Not the mild cold of a winter morning, but the deep, bone-aching cold of the last ice age. Glaciers cover much of northern Europe. The landscape is open and vast, like the tundra of modern Siberia. Woolly mammoths move in slow herds across the frozen plains. Cave lions rest in the shadows of rocky outcrops, and you are standing at the mouth of a cave with a small lamp. The lamp is made from a hollow stone filled with animal fat with a wick made from twisted moss. It gives a small, warm, flickering light. Not much, just enough to see a few feet ahead. You take a step inside. The cold air of the cave wraps around you. The sounds of the outside world fade. The wind, the distant calls of animals, the creak of frozen trees, all of it disappears, and there is silence. A silence so deep and so complete that you can hear your own heartbeat. You move forward slowly, following the passage of the cave as it winds downward into the earth. The ceiling is low in places. You have to bend, sometimes crawl. The light from your small lamp dances on the walls of the cave, throwing shadows that move like living things. And then you turn a corner, and you stop. Because on the wall in front of you, illuminated by the trembling light of your small lamp, are animals: horses, bison, rhinoceroses, mammoths, lions. Painted with remarkable skill and beauty in deep reds and blacks and ochres, the animals seem almost alive. They seem to move in the flickering light. Their muscles are shown with careful shading. Their eyes have a quality of awareness, of presence, that is startling even across the distance of 30,000 years. You are standing in what we now call the Chauvet Cave, and you are looking at some of the oldest known paintings in the world. The Chauvet Cave was discovered in 1994 by a group of 3 French speleologists, people who explore caves. Their names were Jean-Marie Chauvet, Iliette Brunel, and Christian Hilaire. They were exploring a limestone cliff face in the Ardèche region of southern France when they noticed a faint draft of air coming from a small opening in the rock. Air movement in a cave often means there is a larger space somewhere behind the rock. They cleared away some debris. They widened the opening just enough to squeeze through, and they found themselves in a cave that had been sealed by a rock fall for approximately 20,000 years. No human being had entered this cave since the last ice age. The floor was covered in the bones of cave bears, animals that had used the cave for hibernation thousands of years ago. The calcite formations, the stalactites and stalagmites, had grown undisturbed for millennia. There were even the paw prints of a cave bear, preserved perfectly in the soft clay of the cave floor. And on the walls, there were the paintings, more than 300 individual images, animals of at least 13 different species. And not just outlines, not just simple shapes, but fully realized drawings with shading, with perspective, with a sense of movement and life that left the 3 discoverers standing in stunned silence. Iliette Brunel later said that she felt as if time had stopped, as if the people who had made these paintings were still present in the cave, watching. When scientists dated the Chauvet paintings, the results were startling. Some of the images were approximately 36,000 years old. This made them, at the time of their discovery, the oldest known cave paintings in the world. But the real mystery was not just their age, it was their quality. Because the conventional understanding of prehistoric art, the understanding that had been accepted for most of the 20th century, was that early human art developed gradually, that it started simple and became more complex over time, that the earliest art was crude and sophistication came later as humans evolved culturally. But the Chauvet paintings did not fit this story. They were, by any measure, extraordinary works of art. The artists used perspective. They drew animals in overlapping groups to suggest depth. They used the natural contours of the cave wall to give their figures a 3-dimensional quality. They scraped the rock surface before painting to create a smoother canvas. They used multiple colors. They understood how to suggest movement. These were not the fumbling first attempts of a species just discovering art. These were the works of skilled, experienced, thoughtful artists. Artists who had, in all likelihood, learned their craft from others, who were part of a tradition of image-making that stretched back even further than the paintings themselves, which raises the quiet question: how far back does it really go? Now let us move gently into this question, because the Chauvet Cave is remarkable, but it is not alone. Across Europe, across Asia, across Africa and Australia, there are thousands of sites where ancient people left their marks on stone. Paintings, engravings, carvings, handprints, abstract symbols. And when we look at all of these together, a pattern begins to emerge. A pattern that is deeply mysterious and deeply beautiful. In the caves of northern Spain, there is a site called Altamira. The paintings here are approximately 15,000 to 20,000 years old. Slightly more recent than Chauvet, but no less extraordinary. The ceiling of the main chamber is covered with images of bison, painted in rich reds and browns and blacks. The artists used the natural bumps and curves of the cave ceiling to give the bison a rounded, three-dimensional quality. When you lie on the floor of the cave and look up, as the ancient painters themselves must have done, the bison seem to float above you, massive and alive. When these paintings were first discovered in 1879 by a Spanish nobleman named Marcelino Sanz de Sotchuola, the scientific community refused to believe they were genuine. The paintings were too good, they said, too skilled. Prehistoric humans could not have made art of this quality. It must be a forgery. It took nearly 25 years and the discovery of similar paintings at other sites across Europe before the scientific establishment finally accepted that yes, these paintings were real. That yes, people who lived 15,000 years ago were capable of this level of artistic skill and sophistication. The lesson of Altamira, if we are paying attention, is this: we consistently underestimate the people of the past. We look at someone who lived 50,000 years ago and we think they must have been simple, they must have been primitive, they must have been less than us. But the stones and the caves tell a different story. Let us move now from paintings to something even more mysterious. Because while the animal images in the caves are breathtaking, they are, in a sense, the most accessible part of ancient cave art. We can look at a painted bison or a carved horse and feel an immediate connection. We understand what we are looking at. But alongside these beautiful animal images, in caves all over the world, there is something else. Symbols, abstract marks, geometric shapes, dots and lines and spirals and grids and crosses and zigzags and hand stencils and shapes that have no obvious natural referent. These symbols are in many ways more mysterious than the animals, because we do not know what they mean. And here is something that should make you pause. In 2010, a researcher named Genevieve von Petzinger began a systematic study of these abstract symbols. She traveled to caves across Europe and cataloged every abstract mark she could find. Every dot, every line, every geometric shape. When she compiled her data, she found something extraordinary. Across all the cave sites she studied, spread across tens of thousands of years of time and thousands of miles of geography, she identified 32 distinct geometric signs that appeared again and again. Just 32. Not hundreds, not random variations, but 32 specific, consistent shapes that were used by people across Europe for a period of roughly 30,000 years. the same shapes, used over and over, for 30,000 years. This is not random. This is not decoration. This is, in von Petzinger's words, beginning to look very much like a system. Think about what this means. Imagine that you live in France 30,000 years ago, and someone from Spain, someone you have never met, someone whose language you might not even share, arrives at your cave. And yet on the wall of the cave, they recognize symbols that they have also seen in their own homeland. Symbols that carry, perhaps, some shared meaning. How is this possible? How do the same 32 symbols appear consistently across an entire continent over a period of 30,000 years? There are a few possible explanations, and each one is more thought-provoking than the last. The first possibility is that these symbols arose independently in many places because they reflect something universal about human perception. When the human visual system is stimulated in certain ways, by flickering firelight, by altered states of consciousness, by the sensory deprivation of a deep cave, it tends to generate the same kinds of geometric patterns. Dots, grids, zigzags, spirals. These are called entoptic phenomena, and researchers have suggested that at least some cave symbols may represent these inner visual experiences. The second possibility is that these symbols were part of a shared cultural tradition. That the people of Ice Age Europe were more connected, more communicative, more mobile than we generally assume. That they traded ideas along with objects, that they met at seasonal gatherings, that they maintained networks of contact across vast distances. The third possibility is the most remarkable, that these 32 symbols represent the beginnings of a writing system. Not writing as we know it, not a system for recording speech, but a system for recording and communicating specific kinds of information. A visual code, a shared symbolic language. Von Petzinger herself is careful not to make this claim too boldly, but she does not dismiss it either, because the consistency is there. The pattern is there. Something systematic was happening. Now, let us rest in this idea for a moment, because there is something quietly profound about it. We tend to think of writing as a relatively recent invention. The Sumerian script, the Egyptian hieroglyphs, the earliest Chinese characters, these are all roughly 5,000 years old. And we tend to think of the period before writing as a kind of darkness, a time before recorded thought, a time before accumulated knowledge. But what if that is wrong? What if human beings were recording information, systematically and consistently, for tens of thousands of years before what we call writing? What if the 32 symbols of Ice Age Europe are not the clumsy beginnings of symbolic thought, but the mature expression of a tradition that stretches back further than we can currently see? What were they recording? What did those symbols mean to the people who made them and the people who read them? These are questions that we cannot yet answer fully. But the asking of them changes something in how we see the past. It makes the past less dark, less empty, less silent. It fills it with minds, with thought, with the quiet hum of human meaning-making, stretching back across the millennia like a long, unbroken thread. There is one image from the ancient caves that, more than any other, reaches across the distance of time and touches something deep inside us. It is not an animal. It is not an abstract symbol. It is a hand. A human hand pressed against the wall of a cave, outlined in red or black pigment, left there like a signature. like a whisper across 50,000 years that says, simply and quietly, I was here, I existed, I was real. Hand stencils are found in caves all over the world, in France and Spain, in Indonesia and Australia, in Argentina and South Africa. They appear on every inhabited continent made by people who had no contact with each other, separated by oceans and ice sheets and thousands of miles of open land. And yet they all made the same gesture. They all pressed their hand against the stone. They all said, in the only language that needs no translation, I was here. The oldest known hand stencils in the world were found not in Europe, as researchers long assumed, but in the caves of Indonesia. On the island of Sulawesi, in a cave called Ling Timpuseng, there is a hand stencil that was dated, using a technique called uranium-thorium dating, to approximately 40,000 years ago. When this date was announced in 2014, it sent a quiet shock through the archaeological world. Because until that point the general assumption had been that cave art, symbolic art, the full flowering of human creative expression had begun in Europe, that it was somehow connected to a particular group of ancient humans in a particular part of the world. But Sulawesi changed that. Because 40,000 years ago, the people of Sulawesi were making the same kinds of images as the people of France. Animal paintings, hand stencils, abstract marks, at the same time. On opposite sides of the world. This was not a story of art spreading from one place to another. This was a story of something emerging simultaneously in multiple places because it was already present in the human mind. The capacity for symbolic thought, for image making, for reaching across time with a mark on a stone, was not a local development. It was a human one. But the Sulawesi caves gave us something else as well, something that deepened the mystery considerably. Because among the animal paintings found in these caves, there was one image that stopped researchers in their tracks. It was a hunting scene. This might sound unremarkable. Ancient people hunting animals. Of course they would paint hunting scenes. But here is what made this particular image extraordinary. The hunters in the scene were not fully human. They were what researchers call the Ryanthropes. Part human, part animal, figures with human bodies but animal heads. Figures that seem to exist somewhere between the human world and the animal world. This image, found in the Ling Bulu Sipang cave in Sulawesi, is approximately 44,000 years old, and it is the oldest known narrative scene in the history of human art. Not just a symbol, not just an animal, but a story, a scene with multiple figures, arranged in a way that implies action, relationship, meaning. A story about beings that are neither fully human nor fully animal, hunting together. What does it mean? Researchers have suggested several interpretations. Some believe the therianthropic figures represent shamans. In many traditional cultures around the world, shamans are believed to have the ability to transform themselves, to take on the qualities or the form of animals. The hunting scene may represent a shamanic ritual, a spiritual practice in which the boundaries between human and animal are deliberately crossed. Others suggest that the figures represent mythological beings. Spirits. Ancestors who existed in a time before the strict separation of human and animal. Figures from a story that was told and retold around fires for generations before anyone thought to paint it on a cave wall. And others suggest something even more intriguing, that the Ryanthropes represent a kind of thinking that we have largely lost. a way of understanding the relationship between humans and the natural world that does not place humans above or outside of nature, but within it, entangled with it, part of the same continuous web of life. The hunters in the Sulawesi cave are not dominating the animals they pursue. They are, in some sense, becoming them. Let us sit with this idea for a while, because it is a quiet and important one. We live in a world that, for the past several thousand years, has increasingly drawn a sharp line between human beings and the rest of nature. We have built cities. We have created technologies that insulate us from the weather, from the seasons, from the rhythms of the natural world. We have developed philosophies and religions that place humans at the center of creation, separate from and superior to the animals around us. And this has given us many things. It has given us science and medicine and literature and music, and all the extraordinary achievements of human civilization. But it may also have made us forget something. Something that the people of Sulawesi, 44,000 years ago, still understood. That we are animals too. That we are part of the same story as the horses and the bison and the mammoths painted on the cave walls. That the line between human and animal is not as sharp as we like to think. The oldest narrative scene in human history is a story about crossing that line. Perhaps that is not a coincidence. Now let us move into perhaps the most fascinating and the most contested part of our story tonight. Because so far we have been speaking mostly about art, about images and symbols and the expression of human creativity and spiritual life. But some researchers believe that the cave markings contain something more than art, something more than symbols. They believe that the ancient people who made these marks were recording information, specific, practical, detailed information about the world around them. And if they are right, then what we have been calling prehistoric art may need a new name. It may need to be called something more like a library. Let us begin with the work of a researcher named Ben Bacon. Bacon is not a professional archaeologist. He is a furniture conservator from London, someone who restores antique furniture for a living. But he has a deep interest in ancient history, and in 2021, working with a team of academic researchers, he published a study that made a quiet but significant claim. He believed he had decoded part of the meaning of the marks found alongside animal images in European cave art. Specifically, he focused on a set of marks that appear repeatedly near painted animals in caves across Europe. Dots, lines, and a Y-shaped symbol that appears in many sites. Previous researchers had noticed these marks, but had generally interpreted them as decorative or as symbols of unknown meaning. Bacon looked at them differently. He noticed that the dots and lines appeared in sequences that varied in length. Sometimes there were 2 or 3 marks. Sometimes there were 9 or 10. And the sequences seemed to be associated consistently with specific animals. He began to wonder whether the sequences might represent numbers, and specifically, whether they might represent months of the year. He tested this idea against what we know about the behavior of the animals depicted, and he found a remarkable correlation. The number of marks associated with a particular animal appeared to correspond to the months of the year during which that animal would be most active, the months during which it would be most relevant to hunters, the months during which it would be giving birth, migrating, or gathering in large groups. In other words, the marks might be a calendar, a lunar calendar, tracking the months of the year and recording when different animals would be available for hunting. Now, Let us be careful here. This interpretation is not universally accepted. Other researchers have raised questions about the methodology, about the sample sizes, about whether the correlations are as strong as Bacon's team suggests. Science is a process of questioning and testing and refining, and this idea is still in the early stages of that process. But even the possibility is extraordinary, because if Bacon is right, even partially right, then the dots and lines beside the animals in the caves of Europe are not just decoration. They are notes. They are records. They are Ice Age humans writing down what they knew about the world, in a system that was clear enough and consistent enough to be used and understood across thousands of years and hundreds of miles. They are, in the truest sense, a form of writing. Writing that predates what we call writing by tens of thousands of years. And this is not the only claim of this kind, because in recent years, several researchers have suggested that the cave paintings may contain astronomical information as well. Let us look at this carefully. In 2019, a team of researchers from the universities of Edinburgh and Kent published a study examining the animal paintings in several major European cave sites. They were specifically looking at the positions of dots and marks that appear around the animal images, marks that had previously been interpreted as decorative. And they found something remarkable. When they mapped the positions of these marks against the positions of stars in the night sky, as they would have appeared during the Ice Age, they found consistent correlations. The marks appeared to correspond to specific star clusters, specifically to the Pleiades, a cluster of stars that was, in many ancient cultures, associated with the seasons and with the passage of time. The animal images, the researchers suggested, were not just pictures of animals. They were star maps. The animals represented constellations. The dots around them represented specific stars, and the sequences of marks that Ben Bacon had interpreted as lunar calendars were, in this interpretation, records of astronomical events, records of when specific star clusters rose and set, and how this corresponded to the behavior of animals on the Earth below. Think about what this means. These Ice Age artists were not just skilled painters. They were observers of the sky. They had watched the stars carefully enough over enough generations to identify patterns, to connect what happened in the sky with what happened on the Earth, to understand that the rising of a particular star cluster in the east at dawn meant that the reindeer herds would be moving soon, or that the salmon would be running in the rivers, or that the cold would be deepening and it was time to prepare. They were, in the most fundamental sense, scientists. Careful, patient, systematic observers of the natural world, recording their observations in a form that could be passed on to the next generation, and the generation after that, and the generation after that, for 30,000 years. There is a kind of humility required to fully absorb this, because we live in a world that is very proud of its knowledge. We have universities and research institutes and particle accelerators and space telescopes. We have accumulated more information about the physical world in the last 300 years than in all of previous human history, and we are right to be proud of this. But when we look at the cave walls of Ice Age Europe, we see people who had already understood something fundamental. They had understood that knowledge is fragile, that a single human life is very short, that the things you learn in your lifetime, the places where the herds gather, the seasons when the rivers flood, the stars that rise before the winter comes. All of this knowledge dies with you unless you find a way to preserve it. They had understood that the only way to make knowledge last is to write it down, to put it somewhere outside of your own mind, to carve it into stone where it will still be there when you are gone. And they did this. 50,000 years ago, they did this. Long before Egypt. Long before Mesopotamia. Long before Greece or Rome or any of the civilizations that we usually credit with the invention of recorded knowledge. The first librarians worked by firelight, deep in the earth, carving their records into the walls of caves. The cave walls are not the only place where Ice Age humans left their messages. They also carved objects. Small, portable, three-dimensional sculptures that could be carried from place to place, traded, gifted, used in rituals, and perhaps most importantly, used to teach. Among the most mysterious of these objects are the figurines that researchers call Venus figurines. These are small sculptures of female figures, typically between 4 and 25 centimeters tall, carved from stone or bone or ivory or fired clay. They have been found across an enormous geographic range, from Western Europe to Siberia, spanning a period of roughly 30,000 years. And they share a set of striking characteristics. They are almost universally female. They typically emphasize certain aspects of the female body, the breasts, the hips, the abdomen, in a way that suggests these features were considered particularly significant. They usually have small, indistinct heads. Some have no feet, or feet that taper to a point, as if they were designed to be pushed into the earth. Many have no facial features at all. The most famous of these is the Venus of Willendorf, found in Austria in 1908 and dated to approximately 25,000 years ago. She is small enough to hold in the palm of your hand, carved from a reddish limestone, her body rounded and full, her head covered with what may be braided hair or perhaps a cap of woven material. She is, in every sense of the word, an extraordinary object, and we do not fully understand what she meant to the people who made her. The interpretations of the Venus figurines are many and varied. Some researchers believe they are fertility symbols, objects associated with the desire for children, for successful births, for the continuation of the community. The emphasis on the reproductive aspects of the female body, they argue, supports this interpretation. Others believe they are goddess figures, representations of a divine feminine principle that was worshipped across Ice Age Europe and Asia. They point to the wide geographic distribution of the figurines as evidence of a shared religious tradition, a spiritual culture that connected Ice Age communities across vast distances. Some researchers have suggested that the figurines are self-portraits, that they were made by women, representing their own bodies as seen from above, looking down at themselves. This interpretation would explain the distorted proportions, the large abdomen and breasts and hips, the absence of feet, which would not be visible in a self-portrait of this kind. And still others have suggested that the figurines are teaching tools, that they were used to convey information about pregnancy, childbirth, and the female body, that they were, in effect, medical textbooks carved in stone. This last interpretation is one that deserves a little more attention. Because when you look at the Venus figurines not as art objects but as information objects, some interesting details emerge. Several of the figurines show what appear to be stages of pregnancy. The abdomen is shown at different levels of fullness in different figurines, as if each one represents a different point in the 9-month process. Some figurines show features that experienced midwives or healers might consider medically significant. The positioning of the body, the way weight is distributed, the representation of certain physical changes that occur during pregnancy. If these figurines were indeed used to teach about pregnancy and childbirth, then they represent something remarkable. They represent a medical knowledge tradition that stretches back 25,000 years or more. A tradition of women's knowledge, carefully observed and carefully recorded, passed from one generation to the next in the form of small, portable, durable objects. Knowledge about the most important and most dangerous experience that any member of an Ice Age community could face. The knowledge of how to bring a new life safely into the world. And here we come to something that I want you to hold gently in your mind for a moment. Because so much of what we know about the ancient past, so much of what fills our history books and our museums and our popular imagination, is the story of things that were built to last. Temples and tombs and monuments, things made of stone and metal, things that survived because they were large and hard and durable. But most of human life is not made of stone. Most of human knowledge is not carved into monuments. Most of human knowledge is passed from person to person in conversation, in demonstration, in story, in song. And most of that knowledge from most of human history is gone. The Venus figurines give us a glimpse of it. The cave paintings give us a glimpse of it. The carved symbols give us a glimpse of it. But it is only a glimpse. For every symbol carved into stone, there were 1,000 conversations that left no trace. For every painted animal on a cave wall, there were 1,000 stories told around a fire that have been completely and irretrievably lost. We are reading the footnotes of a library that no longer exists, and what the footnotes tell us is extraordinary enough. Let us go deeper now. Not just deeper into the caves, though we will do that too, but deeper into the question of why. Why did ancient people go into caves at all? This might seem like a simple question with a simple answer. They lived in caves. They sheltered in caves. Of course, they painted on the walls of the places where they lived. But here is something that changes that picture considerably. Most of the great painted caves of Europe were not living spaces. The evidence of daily life, the hearths, the food remains, the tools of everyday existence, these are usually found near the entrance of caves, where light and air were available, where the practical business of survival could be carried on. But the paintings are almost never at the entrance. They are deep inside, sometimes very deep inside. In some caves, the paintings are found only after crawling through narrow passages for hundreds of meters, after descending into chambers that are completely cut off from the outside world, after navigating darkness so complete that without a light source, you cannot see your hand in front of your face. The people who made these paintings did not wander into a convenient cave and casually decorate the walls. They made a deliberate journey, a difficult journey, a journey that required preparation, that required courage, that required a specific intention. They went deep into the earth on purpose, and the question of why they did this is one of the most fascinating and most debated questions in all of prehistoric archaeology. To understand one possible answer, we need to talk about the nature of deep caves. When you go deep enough into a cave, something happens to your senses. the temperature becomes constant. In most limestone caves in Europe, the deep interior maintains a temperature of around 12 to 14 degrees Celsius, year-round, regardless of what is happening outside. Summer or winter, ice age or warming period, the deep cave is always the same temperature. The humidity is very high, often close to 100%, and the silence. The silence of a deep cave is unlike any silence you will encounter in the surface world. On the surface, there is always sound, wind in the trees, the distant call of a bird, the creak of the earth itself. Even on the quietest night in the most remote place there is sound, but in a deep cave there is nothing, absolutely nothing. And in that absolute silence, in that constant temperature, in that complete darkness, something happens to the human mind. Researchers who have studied the effects of cave environments on human consciousness describe experiences that are remarkably consistent. A heightening of the other senses, an increased sensitivity to small sounds, small movements, small fluctuations of light, a loosening of the ordinary boundaries of self, a feeling of being held, enclosed, contained by the earth, and in many cases, visual experiences, shapes and patterns that seem to emerge from the darkness, figures that appear on the cave walls in the flickering light of a small lamp, animals that seem to move, faces that seem to look back. Some researchers, most notably the South African archaeologist David Lewis Williams, have suggested that these experiences were not accidental, that the deep caves were specifically chosen as places for altered states of consciousness, that the people who went into them were shamans or spiritual practitioners of some kind, who used the sensory environment of the cave deliberately to induce visionary experiences, and that the paintings on the cave walls were not pictures of animals seen in the outside world. They were pictures of animals seen in visions, images that appeared to the painter in the darkness of the cave, in the flickering of firelight, in the heightened state of consciousness that deep cave environments can produce. The painter was not recording what they saw outside. They were recording what they saw inside. They were mapping the landscape of the mind. This idea is controversial. Not all researchers accept it. Some argue that we are projecting modern concepts of altered states and shamanism onto people whose actual practices we cannot know. Some argue that the evidence for shamanic interpretation is weaker than its proponents suggest, and they are right to raise these questions. Intellectual honesty requires us to hold all interpretations with some humility. But there is something in the shamanic interpretation that feels, intuitively, correct. Because when you look at the paintings in the deep caves, when you try to imagine what it was like to stand in that darkness with a small lamp, surrounded by silence and stone, and to see these animals emerge from the rock in the dancing light, you understand that something more than a simple record-keeping exercise was happening here. Something was being sought. Something was being found. Something that required darkness and depth and the deliberate journey away from the ordinary world of sunlight and wind and daily life. Something that could only be found in the world beneath the world. There is a concept in many traditional cultures around the world that anthropologists call the axis mundi, the axis of the world, the central point where the upper world, the human world, and the lower world all connect, the place where it is possible to move between different levels of reality. In many cultures, this axis mundi is represented as a tree or a mountain or a pole. but in others it is a cave. A cave is a place where you enter the body of the earth, where you go below the surface of the ordinary world, where you cross a threshold between what is visible and what is hidden. And in the deep caves of the Ice Age, perhaps, people found a literal axis mundi, a physical place where the ordinary world gave way to something else, where the wall between the visible and the invisible became thin enough to touch, and where in that thinness they pressed their hands against the stone and left their marks and spoke to whatever was listening in the darkness. Let us think now about something that we often overlook when we study ancient cave art. We think about the people who made it, but we rarely think about the people who looked at it. Who were the audience for these paintings and carvings? Who came to the deep caves to see what had been left there? And what did they learn when they saw it? Here is something that the archaeological evidence tells us, quietly but clearly. The caves were visited repeatedly, not just once by the artists who made the paintings, but over and over again, over long periods of time, by many different people. We know this because researchers have found multiple layers of paintings in many caves, new images painted over old ones, different styles from different periods overlapping on the same wall, evidence of fires made at different times, leaving multiple layers of ash and charcoal on the cave floors. Some caves show evidence of visitation spanning thousands of years. The Chauvet Cave contains paintings that were made at least 2 separate times, with a gap of perhaps 5,000 years between the earliest and the most recent images. Different artists, separated by a gulf of time as large as the entire span of recorded human history, came to the same cave and added to the same walls. They knew the cave was there. They knew it had been used before. They came deliberately to a specific place because of what that place meant. The cave was not just a canvas, it was a destination, a place to which people returned generation after generation because of what they found there. And what they found there was knowledge. Now let us think about how knowledge was transmitted in the Ice Age world. There were no schools, no books, no universities, no written language, at least not in any form we have yet been able to decode fully. Knowledge was transmitted in the oldest and most fundamental way, person to person, mouth to ear, demonstration to observation, an elder showing a younger person how to nap a flint into a sharp edge, a healer showing an apprentice which plants to use for which ailments, a hunter showing a child how to read the signs that an animal has passed this way recently. This kind of knowledge transmission is extraordinarily effective. It is also extraordinarily fragile because it depends on the chain of transmission remaining unbroken. If the elder dies before passing on what they know, the knowledge dies with them. If the community is scattered by disease or disaster, the chain breaks. If there is no one left to learn, there is no one left to know. And this fragility must have been something that Ice Age people understood very well, because they lived in a world where communities were small and scattered, where the death of a few key individuals could devastate the knowledge base of an entire group, where the accumulated learning of generations could be wiped out in a single bad winter. They needed a way to make knowledge last. They needed a way to store it outside of any single human mind. And so they put it in the caves. Imagine, then, what the cave was for a child growing up in an Ice Age community. Perhaps there was a moment at a certain age when the elders decided you were ready to be taken into the cave, ready to see what was there. You have heard about it your whole life, perhaps. The cave is part of your community's story. It is mentioned in the songs that are sung around the fire. It is referenced in the stories that the elders tell on long winter nights. And now the day has come. You are taken to the entrance of the cave. The darkness inside is absolute. But one of the elders carries a lamp and another perhaps carries a torch, and you follow them into the earth. The sounds of the outside world fade. The temperature drops and then stabilizes. The darkness closes around you like a second skin. And then the elder raises the lamp, and the animals appear. The horses and the bison and the mammoths, painted with a skill and a vividness that seems impossible in this underground world. They fill the walls around you. They cover the ceiling above you. They seem to breathe in the flickering light, and the elder begins to speak, not to you perhaps, or not only to you, to the animals, to the marks on the walls, to the knowledge that is stored here waiting to be recalled. What were they teaching? We cannot know for certain, but we can make some thoughtful guesses. The animals painted in the caves were the animals that mattered most to Ice Age hunters. The horses and bison and reindeer that provided food and clothing and tools. The mammoths whose bones were used to build shelters. The lions and bears that were competitors and dangers. Knowing these animals, truly knowing them, was a matter of survival. Knowing their habits, knowing their seasonal movements, knowing the signs that they had been in an area recently, knowing how to approach them without being heard or smelled, knowing which ones were dangerous and in what circumstances, knowing how to make the tools needed to hunt them effectively. This is not simple knowledge. It is a vast and complex body of information that took years to acquire and required constant updating as conditions changed. And in the cave, painted on the walls with extraordinary skill and detail, were the animals themselves, captured in moments of movement and stillness, shown from angles that allowed their anatomy to be studied, depicted in ways that preserved the specific details that a hunter needed to know. The cave was a classroom. The paintings were the textbooks. And the marks alongside them, the dots and lines and symbols, were the notes. Let us pause now in the quiet of this deep place, and let us ask a question that has been running beneath everything we have discussed tonight. If this knowledge was so important, if it was preserved so carefully, if it was passed down across so many thousands of years, then why did it stop? Why did the cave painting tradition come to an end? Why is there a gap of many thousands of years between the last Ice Age cave paintings and the earliest examples of what we call civilization? What happened? The simplest answer is also the most profound. The world changed. Around 12,000 years ago, the last ice age ended. The glaciers that had covered much of Europe and North America began to melt. Sea levels rose. The vast open grasslands of the Ice Age, the landscapes that had supported the great herds of horses and bison and mammoths, began to shrink and fragment as forests spread northward across Europe. The animals that had sustained Ice Age communities for tens of thousands of years began to disappear. The woolly mammoth went extinct. The woolly rhinoceros went extinct. The cave lion, the cave bear, the giant deer, all gone within a few thousand years. The world that the cave painters had known, the world they had recorded so carefully, the world whose rhythms and patterns they had spent 30,000 years learning to read, that world ceased to exist. And the knowledge that was stored in the caves became, in a very real sense, obsolete. The herds no longer moved in the patterns recorded on the cave walls. The stars no longer rose at the times that corresponded to the animal behaviors painted alongside them. The landscape itself was transformed beyond recognition. The library was still there, but the world it described was gone. And so, gradually, people stopped going to the caves. The chains of transmission that had carried this ancient knowledge from generation to generation began to thin and eventually to break. The elders who remembered what the symbols meant grew old and died. The children they might have taught were occupied with new challenges, new landscapes, new ways of finding food in a world that was rapidly changing. Agriculture was beginning to emerge in the Middle East and in parts of Asia. Small communities of hunter-gatherers were beginning to settle into permanent villages, planting crops, raising animals, building structures that would last longer than a single season. A new way of living was beginning, and with it, a new way of recording knowledge. The cave wall gave way to the clay tablet. The carved symbol gave way to the written word. The long, unbroken tradition of Ice Age knowledge-keeping was replaced by something new, something that would eventually lead through a long and winding path to the books and screens and libraries of our modern world. But something was also lost in that transition, something that we are still in quiet moments still mourning. What was lost? This is a question worth sitting with, because it is tempting to see the end of the Ice Age cave painting tradition as simply the replacement of one system by a better one. Agriculture is more productive than hunting and gathering. Writing is more flexible than carved symbols. Civilization, for all its problems, supports larger populations and generates more knowledge than a small band of Ice Age hunters following the herds. All of this is true, but the people who painted the caves of Chauvet and Altamira and Sulawesi possess something that is genuinely rare in human history. They possessed a complete and intimate knowledge of the natural world. Not the knowledge of a scientist studying nature from the outside, taking measurements and running experiments, though that knowledge is also valuable and extraordinary. But the knowledge of someone who lives inside nature, who is part of it, who wakes up every morning in direct contact with the rhythms of the earth, the movements of animals, the patterns of weather and season and star. The knowledge of someone who has watched the same herd of horses for their entire life, and whose parents watched the same herd before them, and whose children will watch it after them. The knowledge of someone who knows, with complete certainty, that the first frost will come within 2 weeks of the rising of a particular star cluster, because they have seen it happen every year of their life, and heard the stories of their grandparents who saw it happen every year of their lives, and the stories go back further than any living person can remember. This kind of knowledge, this deep, intimate, embodied knowledge of the natural world, is almost completely gone from modern human experience. And the cave paintings are, among other things, its memorial. We are coming now to the end of our journey tonight, not the end of the mystery. The mystery does not end. It only deepens the further into it you go. But we are coming to the end of what we can say with some confidence about the 50,000-year-old stone carvings and cave paintings that have survived to reach us. And I want to spend this final section thinking not about the past, but about the present. About what it means for us here now to know that these things exist. Think about the person who carved those marks into the ochre stone in Blombo's cave 73,000 years ago. We do not know their name. We do not know their face. We do not know what language they spoke, or what they believed, or what they feared, or what they loved. We know almost nothing about them, except this: they made marks on a stone with intention and care. They created something that they believed was worth creating. They left something behind, and 73,000 years later we found it. We picked it up, we studied it, we puzzled over it, we argued about what it meant. We wrote papers and gave lectures and had long conversations exactly like this one about what that person was trying to say. The message traveled 73,000 years and arrived. Not intact, not fully understood, not decoded and translated and read with perfect clarity, but arrived. The act of communication succeeded across a gulf of time that is almost beyond human comprehension. That person reached across 73,000 years and touched us, and we felt it. There is something in this that I find deeply moving, because it says something important about what it means to be human. We are the only species we know of that does this. That makes marks with the deliberate intention of being understood by someone in a future we will never see. That creates things not for ourselves, not for our immediate community, but for the vast unknown audience of time itself. We do it still. Every book ever written is an act of this same impulse. Every piece of music recorded, every photograph taken, every story told to a child who will one day tell it to their own children, every building designed to stand longer than its architect will live. We are all, in our different ways, pressing our hands against the wall of a cave and saying, "I was here. I understood something. I wanted you to know." And perhaps this is what the 50,000-year-old carvings are ultimately telling us. Not just about the Ice Age world, not just about the animals and the stars and the seasons and the spiritual practices of ancient people, but about us, about what we are at the deepest level. We are creatures who reach across time. We are creatures who refuse to let our understanding die with us. We are creatures who believe, with a faith that requires no doctrine and no theology, that somewhere in some future we will never see, there will be someone who wants to know what we knew. Someone who will pick up the stone we carved. Someone who will stand in the cave where we painted. Someone who will look at the marks we made in the darkness and feel, across all the vast distance of time, something like recognition. Something like, "Yes, I understand, I hear you. The caves are still there." Deep in the limestone hills of France and Spain, in the tropical islands of Indonesia, in the red rock landscapes of Australia, the paintings wait, waiting with the patience of stone, waiting with the patience of 50,000 years. The hands are still on the walls. The animals still move in the light of an imagined fire. The symbols still hold their meanings, close and quiet, like secrets that are almost ready to be told. And somewhere in a laboratory or a library or a field site on a limestone hillside, a researcher is looking at a photograph of a carved mark and frowning slightly and feeling the first small tug of understanding. The message is still arriving. After 50,000 years, it is still arriving. Take a slow breath now. Let the images settle. The caves, the animals, the hands pressed against cold stone. The small lamps throwing their warm, uncertain light on paintings that have waited longer than civilization itself for someone to see them. The marks of people who are gone but not entirely gone, who are present in the stones they touched, who are present in the questions they left us, who are present, in a quiet and mysterious way, in the very fact that we are still asking those questions, still wondering, still reaching back across the darkness to try to understand. Perhaps that is the most important thing the ancient caves tell us. Not what the symbols mean, though that matters. Not when the paintings were made, though that matters too. But the simple and profound fact that the impulse to understand, to record, to communicate, to reach across time with a meaning-laden mark, is not a recent development. It is not a product of civilization. It is not something that emerged with writing or cities or philosophy or science. It is as old as we are. It was there at the very beginning, pressing its hand against the stone, leaving its mark in the darkness, trusting that someone someday would find it and understand. So tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and the world grows quiet around you, carry this with you into sleep. You are part of a very long story, a story that began 50,000 years ago in a cave lit by a small flame where a hand moved carefully across cold stone. A story that has been added to generation by every person who ever watched the stars, or studied an animal, or wondered how the world works, or felt the urge to put their understanding into a form that would last. You are in that story. Every question you have ever asked is in that story. Every moment of wonder and curiosity and the quiet satisfaction of understanding something that was mysterious before, all of it is part of the same long conversation that began in the caves. The conversation that says, "We are here, we are paying attention, we want to understand, and we want you to know what we understood. Rest now. Let the cave walls fade gently into the background of your mind. Let the animals settle into stillness. Let the hand on the wall remain there, patient and quiet as it has remained for 50,000 years. The message has been delivered. The story continues. And somewhere deep in the stone, the ancient mind rests easy, knowing that someone found the marks, knowing that someone listened, knowing that the long journey of the message across all those thousands of years of darkness and silence was worth making, because you are here, and you heard. Good night.